today we are going to be talking about the 5 principles of creating clarity in your writing. Now, my name is Haley, and for those of you who this is your first webinar with me or your first time with ProWritingAid, I am the head of learning here at ProWritingAid, which basically means that I get to nerd out on writing and editing all day. And before I came to the ProWritingAid team, I worked as an English teacher in grade level chair and as a curriculum developer as well. So I really like thinking about words. I really like thinking about how to teach people about words and sentences and craft and all of that type of stuff. And today we will be diving deep into 5 principles again for creating clarity in your manuscripts. So here are our objectives today. First, we're going to go through why clarity is the most important goal for all writers. After that, we're going to talk about 5 key principles to make your writing more clear. And then we're also going to learn how to apply those principles to your writing to make it more effective. Now, all of the principles that I'm going to cover today will be related to ProWritingAid. So I'm going to be showing you how to make or to use these principles with our tool, but I'll also be showing you how to use them just by yourself. So if you don't have ProWritingAid, don't worry, all of the principles will apply to you as well, and I'll teach you how to use them yourself with that too. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So like I said, I believe that that clarity is the most important part of storytelling and the most important goal for all writers. And that's because if your work isn't clear, it's not going to engage your readers. So if we think back to kind of a writer's main job, it's to get our meaning across clearly and effectively. And if our writing is too complicated or hard to follow, then we're not doing our job. When our writing is unclear, that means our readers are going to spend more time trying to figure out what we're saying or, going to a dictionary and looking up a word than they will actually engaging with our ideas. And so good writing prioritizes clearly communicating ideas over showing off using fancy, confusing language, unclear sentence structures, and that type of thing. Again, if we come back to writing at its core is about communicating ideas. And if we're not setting up our sentences and using our words in an effective way, then we're just not doing a good job at communicating those ideas. So I truly believe that our sentences and our word choice should be a vehicle for communicating those ideas, not, a fancy way to kind of showboat and show off. So let's kind of nail down what I mean when I'm talking about clarity. So when I'm talking about clarity, I'm talking about 3 things. First, how easy your writing is to understand. And I'm going to come back to that in a second because easy varies depending on what you're writing and who you're writing for. So first, how easy it is to understand. Second, whether or not your sentences are set up in a reader-focused way. And third, whether or not you're using rich, specific language that adds to your reader's understanding. And again, I want to highlight here that we're talking about the reader in both of these places. So all of the things when we focus on clarity, we always want to circle back to the reader. And who our reader is will dictate what's clear and what's not clear. So for myself, if I'm working on writing something for an elementary student or I'm working on writing something for an adult, what's clear for a young student will be different than what's clear for an adult. And similarly, even if you're writing for different types of adults in different types of audiences, what's clear for one will be different than what's clear for another. So clarity is a sliding scale. It is not always the same. And I want us to keep that in mind as we're going throughout this presentation. As we tackle every single principle, we need to remember that clarity is sliding and it'll look different for me than it will look for everyone else. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we have 2 pieces of clarity. So one, making sure our sentences are set up in an easy to understand way, but the other piece is about using rich and specific language. Easy to understand does not always equate to easy to read, right? Or to boring, or to simple, or to dull. Easy to understand often means that we're using rich and specific language, and we'll talk more about word choice later. But again, it's important to recognize that clarity does not just mean simple, dull, rote, and boring. That is not clear because if something is simple, dull, rote, and boring, it'll probably be less specific than we really want it to be for our readers. So we're always going to be focusing on those 2 pieces. Again, both how clear something is, but also how specific and how rich it is so that our reader is getting a full picture. So that was what clarity is. On the flip side, what clarity isn't is first how simple or juvenile the ideas in your writing are. And this is so important. Being clear does not mean being simple or being too, young or anything like that. If you can communicate very complicated, complex ideas with clear writing, and I would argue that it's actually more important to use clear prose when you're communicating difficult and complex ideas. So you can have complicated adult themes, mature themes, with still, using clarity to get those across in the right way. And it also has nothing to do with whether or not your prose is engaging, unique, and exciting. My goal here is not to get us in a situation where all of our writing sounds exactly the same. It's actually the exact opposite. I want our writing to be specific and rich for what we are trying to say so that our exact meaning is conveyed as effectively as possible to our readers. So clarity starts at the sentence level. When we have clear sentences, we will have clear stories. And that's because every single sentence is a complete story in itself. I want you to think about your sentence as a mini movie that your reader is playing in their head. And if this movie is inaccurate or incomplete or not specific enough, then the movie will be inaccurate. So if we look at this example of this image here, right? If I were just to say, the story took place on a mountainside, that sentence is not clear because it doesn't give any of the details that we need about, what kind of mountain we're near, what the sky looks like, what the castle looks like. Or even if I was just to say the story took place in a castle, you could have widely different interpretations of what that actually means. So when we're thinking about each sentence, again, we're thinking about A, setting it up in a way that our readers can really engage with it. And then B, that second part, using specific enough language so that that movie that they're playing is accurate. If our language is not specific enough, again, that movie will not be accurate. There's kind of two problems you can run into. First, that sentence is set up in a confusing way, so it doesn't even make sense. And then second, that it's not specific enough, so they're not getting the right interpretation of what should be happening. So again, we'll be talking about this throughout the presentation, but those are the two things I want you to keep in mind. We need to be clear, so we need to make sure that we're set up in a way that we can interpret what's happening. And second, we need to make sure that the language we use is specific enough so that the movie is accurate, right? The movie is not muddled, it's specific and clear. As I said, when we have clear sentences, then we get clear paragraphs and we get clear stories. It's impossible to have a clear story if your sentences are not set up in a clear way. So how do we do that? The 5 principles of creating clarity are: first, to make your subjects and verbs the stars of your writing. Second, to prioritize working words over glue words. Third, to ensure that your readability score is appropriate for your audience. Fourth, to choose specific and vivid words. And fifth, to show your reader what's happening, not to tell them. Now, as we start to dive into all of these principles, I want to again highlight that what we will talk about today, I will show you how to do this with ProWritingAid software so that you can see some easy ways to make these fixes. But that being said, all of the principles, I will also show you how to work out by yourself as well. And Star in the Q&A asked if I will send the slides, and I will be happy to send the slides with the replay so you guys can get these with yourself as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Our first principle of clarity, again, is to make our subjects and verbs the stars of our writing. So when we think about subjects and verbs, first let's think about subjects. Our subjects are the main actors of our text. It's important to prioritize them and to make them their stars. Our verbs, on the other hand, are our action words. They keep our readers moving forward and engaging with the action, with what's happening in our story. When we give power to our subjects and verbs, our writing becomes more direct, clear, and effective. So how do we do this? The first way is to eliminate something called passive voice. When you've written a sentence with passive voice, that means that you've put the object of the sentence ahead of the subject. So the object kind of becomes the star, not the subject. This is taking power away from the subject, which should be the star of your sentence. Here's an example of a very simple passive voice sentence. The present was opened by Jane. So in this sentence, the present is the object. It's not doing anything, it's being opened, right? It's not performing the action. Jane is the subject. She's the star. She's the one who's doing something. But she comes so far at the end of the sentence that she is no longer the star. We focus on the present. And if you go back to that idea that I was just talking about previously, that every sentence is like a mini movie you play in your head. If I were to read this sentence incredibly slowly, the present was opened by Jane. Jane, who should be the star, wouldn't even pop into that movie until the very end. So that means that we are taking the power away from that subject, who should be the star. Now, this is a simple sentence construction, right? So the present was opened by Jane is a 6-word sentence. It's not that hard. It's probably not going to get in the way of your reader's understanding. So they'll probably be able to read the sentence quickly. But that being said, once your sentences get more complicated, or if you need to understand who the subject is earlier, passive voice can be dangerous and can get in the way of your reader's meaning. And someone asked a question in the Q&A about people who speak in a way that sounds like passive voice. I'm going to go into some instances where all of these are okay as well too. So we'll get to that in a second. But before I do that, one of the things I want us to remember as we're going through this is that all of these are suggestions that you're going to apply to your writing to make it more effective. But again, we're not going to apply them across the board. And I'll show you how and when to use these in a little bit. Okay, so that's the first thing. We need to make our subjects the stars. So in most instances, we're going to look for active voice, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. The second piece of that is focusing on our verbs. So our subjects and verbs need to be the stars. In order to make our verbs the stars, we need to reduce something called hidden verbs. Verbs are the action words in our writing. So as I said, they keep our readers moving forward and engaging with the action in our story. Sometimes as writers, we do something called nominalization. When we're doing nominalization, that means we turn our actual action words, our verbs, into nouns, and we add a weak verb in their place. Here's some examples of that. So, for instance, you might say, I'm going to make a decision on Friday instead I'm going to decide on Friday. These are all examples of nominalizations. Again, the word on the left, analyze, decide, review, adjust, explain, announce. These are our verbs. These are our powerful action words. When we hide them and put them behind a weaker verb, we're taking the power away from what we're saying. This is really common if you're like nervous about something that's going to happen. So, maybe you're talking to your partner or to somebody at work or something like that, and you haven't quite made up your mind and you don't want to come across as strong as saying, oh, I'm going to decide Friday. So you say, oh, I'll make a decision or something like that. It basically takes the power away from that action that you're saying. And again, there are some instances where you'll want to use this, which we'll talk about in a second. But overall, when we're writing and trying to convey meaning to our readers, we always want to go with we most of the time want to go with the instance where the verb is as powerful as possible and also where the option is less wordy. So perform an analysis is more wordy and more of a mouthful than just saying analyze. So we want to lean into the example in most instances where the verb is more powerful and the option is less wordy. Now, as I just mentioned, neither of these are grammatically incorrect. So if you're, using Microsoft Word or Google Docs or something like that, using passive voice or having a hidden verb is not grammatically incorrect. It's not going to flag your grammar checker. But they should be used sparingly. And this goes back to kind of the entire ethos of this presentation. When we talk about these principles, your job as the writer is to figure out when they apply and when they do not. So we want to be sure that we're understanding, okay, if I'm using passive voice, that's okay, but I need to be doing it consciously and not just kind of having it happen to me as a bad writing habit. So here are some instances when you can use passive voice, when it's okay. So first, if the subject of the sentence is unknown. So say you are writing Outlander, right? You're writing Outlander and you're writing about a stone monolith or something, or you're writing about Stonehenge or something that appeared and you don't know who put it there. That's okay. You don't have a subject at that sentence. You can say Stonehenge was built in 8 BC or whenever it was built, and you don't have to have a subject because you don't know who it is. It's okay in that instance. It's also okay if the subject of the sentence is irrelevant to understanding the meaning. So say you are writing a novel about 1950s era New York or something like that, and you want to talk about when the Time and Life building was constructed. So you say something like the Time and Life building was constructed in 1952 or whatever. it's okay in that instance. So if you want to hide the subject at that point, it doesn't really matter because it's not relevant to the rest of what you're saying. You can also use it if you want to be deliberately vague about responsibility. So sometimes in crime novels, where a perpetrator is doing something and the main character doesn't realize what's happening, something was left on a doorstep, or a murder was committed. It's okay to be deliberately vague at that point because it's adding something for your reader. You want to create that sense of mystery, and it's okay in that instance to be deliberately vague. You might notice that this is something that happens a lot in newspaper headlines because it gets us to click and to kind of go in further. So saying like, person was murdered in the streets, and you're like, by who? And so you click in. That's an example of using passive voice in a way that's designed to create interest in the reader. And that's the goal here. It's okay to use passive voice, but the goal is to make sure that you're using it on purpose. If it's not in one of these scenarios, or again, if you're not using it on purpose, you want to lean into having the subject be the star of your sentence, not the object. So to go back into the question about, is it okay to use it if people who speak in a way that sounds like passive voice, that could be okay. So if you're formatting dialogue or something like that for a character who's a little bit nervous, we'll go into hidden verbs in a second, like if they feel a little nervous or they want to be vague about who did something, it is okay to use this. But again, we want to use it consciously, and we want to decide when we use it rather than have it kind of be a bad habit that peppers our writing. Same thing with hidden verbs. So it is okay to use hidden verbs if you want to be more formal or stilted in your language. So again, if you are speaking to your boss, or you're writing to your partner, or you're writing in an instance where you don't want it to come across as firm, you can totally use a hidden verb in that instance. You can also, again, use both of these if you're trying to define a character's voice through dialogue. If your character is very nervous, if they're very deliberately vague about responsibility or something like that, again, it's okay to use these, but we want them to be the exception that you're choosing to use rather than the rule. So if you have these, what do you do to make edits? The first thing to fix passive voice is look for places where you've used the word by. So the present was opened by Jane. The word by is usually an indication that you've used passive voice. You can also look for to be plus verb constructions. And when you found those, just swap your sentence so that the subject comes first. So the present was opened by Jane becomes Jane opened the present. Now, if you have hidden verbs, you can look, these are a little bit harder to find by yourself, but you can look for endings like ment, tion, sion, ance. These are indications that you might have hidden verbs in your writing. And then what you want to do is take the noun part, so decision, and make that into a verb, decide. And that can help, again, give power back to your subjects and verbs. Now, as I said, that's the way that you can do it yourself, but we also make it very easy for you to do this in ProWritingAid, which I'm just going to pull up now. So ProWritingAid, which you guys can see here over here, in our real-time checker, we'll pull up style issues like that. So style issues like passive voice. You can also run our style report to find specific instances of passive verbs, as well as hidden verbs here too. So you can come right into the program. It'll show you where you've done things like, again, use passive voice, or where you have used hidden verbs, and it'll offer suggestions for fixing those. So it makes it nice and easy. All right, moving forward, let's talk about my favorite principle of clarity, which is to eliminate glue words and prioritize working words over glue words. So there are two types of words in every sentence: working words and glue words. Working words are the words in your sentence that convey meaning and contain your sentence's most essential information. So think your nouns, your verbs, your adjectives, words that you could not change or you would change the sentence. So for instance, if I said Haley is giving a webinar and I changed Haley to Carol, the meaning of the sentence would change. And if I changed Haley is giving a webinar to Haley is giving a basketball clinic, the meaning of the sentence would change. So those are working words, words that you cannot swap out, or the meaning of the sentence will be different. Glue words are the rest of the words in the sentence. They make the sentence stick together and make sense, but you could change them or swap them out, and the sentence will likely still make sense and still have the same meaning. They're around the 200 or so most common words in the English language, words like in or the. There are a lot of prepositions, a lot of articles that you can swap and replace for each other, and the sentence's meaning will be the same. Now, in your document, as I said, both glue words and working words are necessary for sentences. But when you have too many glue words, your sentence is going to get unnecessarily clunky and long. At ProWritingAid, we like to talk about something called your glue index, which refers to the percentage of your sentence that's made up of those glue words. We typically recommend aiming for a glue percentage of around 40%. So about 40% are those kind of sticky words that make the sentence make sense, but 60% are working. Again, your nouns, your verbs, your adjectives, the words that really make the meaning of the sentence. So 60% should be working, about 40% should be glue. Now, this is an overall benchmark for your document. So some individual sentences might be skewed really far in the favor of working words, some in the favor of glue words. But again, overall, 40% is a good marker to know that my sentences are not too clunky, not too long, and I can make them more specific. So let's try this together. Here's a sentence that has a high glue percentage. It has a 60% glue percentage. The sentence is, Dave walked over into the backyard of the school in order to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in class. I would love for you to tell me in the chat, what are the working words? So what are our essential words? What words could we not change? You can go ahead and drop them just right into the chat. Which words can we not change, or else the meaning of the sentence would shift? I'll give you a couple seconds. All right, we've got Dave, school, bicycle. Dave, bicycle, class. Bicycle, yep, walked, school. Backyard, Dave, bicycle, class. Yeah, exactly. Those are all of the working words. That's exactly what I highlighted as well. Dave walked into the backyard of the school to find a new bicycle that he could use in class. Now, these were the working words because if I shifted them, the sentence would be different. So if I shifted Dave for Haley, the sentence would be different. If I shifted bicycle for roller skates, the sentence would be different. If I shifted class for camp or for the play or anything like that, the sentence would be different. If I shifted school to backyard, the sentence would be different. Nina, no worries. It's okay to use glue words. No worries at all. But again, the key here is that we want to focus in on our working words, right? So our working words, these are the words that we need to keep in this sentence, because now we're going to transition into how we fix it. So if you have a sentence that has too many glue words, what do you do with it? Well, good and bad news. There's not one way to fix it, okay? So there isn't one way to fix a sticky sentence. And I say good and bad news because good news, the reason that there's no one way to fix it is because we can all retain our own author voice, right? We should all retain our own author voice, and we'll all say something a little bit differently to make the sentence, again, get that meaning across, but sound like us. So that's good. Bad because that means that you have to do a little bit of critical thinking and figuring out how to make the sentence more effective in your own way. But let's try that together. So if you were to take this sentence, which again has a glue percentage of 60% and has all of these kind of extra glue words in it, how would you rewrite it? How would you rewrite it to try to bring that glue percentage down? Again, our goal is to eliminate some of these glue words and make the sentence clearer, sharper, and more effective. So I'll give you a couple minutes to try this in the chat, and then we'll see how close you got to what I have. So again, we're trying to rewrite this sentence, removing our glue words to make it sharper and clearer. Okay, if Dave walked to the backyard of the school to see if there was a bike he could use in class. Okay, so that's cutting out of a lot of the prepositions. Yeah, we have Dave walked to the schoolyard to see the new bicycle for his class. Yep. So see, we're getting a slightly different version there. Dave walked into the backyard to see a new bicycle. Dave walked into the school's backyard to see if there was a new bicycle he could use for his class. Yeah, awesome. So this is exactly what I was talking about. We've got multiple different versions of this sentence. Dave walked into the school's backyard to find a new bicycle for class. Exactly. That's exactly the point that we're talking about here. There is not one way to fix a sticky sentence, and all of the different versions that we just went through will all have a lower glue index, which is good. it doesn't matter that they're all different. It's actually good, as I was saying, that they're all different because, again, we're all kind of retaining our own authorial voice in how we'll talk about this. So I had Dave checked the schoolyard for a new bicycle to use in class, which again brings it about our glue percentage down to 38, slightly different than what everyone else has. And again, that's totally fine. The goal here when we're fixing sticky sentences is to find our essential information and rewrite the sentence in a way that still conveys that essential information, but switches it up a bit to be more clear. So how do you do this? Again, there's not one way to fix it, but the best way, if you're doing this by yourself, is to look for sentences that are first overly long. So I would say if they have more than 18 or so words, that's probably too long, a good indication it might be sticky. If they have lots of prepositions, again, if we think back to that list of the 200 or so glue words, a lot of them are prepositions and articles, and same thing with conjunctions. When you have conjunctions, you're likely joining sentences together, joining clauses together. And so having multiple of those increases the probability that you have glue words. So if you have a sticky sentence, you first need to look for sentences that you can identify. If you're doing this yourself, again, a good marker is something that's 18 words or longer. If you're reading, somewhere where you're kind of tumbling over your words, that's probably a sentence that's too long. And then your job is to look at the sentence, find the working words, and then find the glue words. And just like someone said in the chat, ProWritingAid can help. Now, ProWritingAid, just like we talked about, can help you find your sticky and semi-sticky sentences. So sticky have the highest glue percentage. They have above 60%. Semi-sticky are between 40 and 60. So they might be, you might leave them and decide, okay, it's close enough that I'm going to leave it. But either way, when you highlight the sentence, it will tell you what the glue words are so that you know what to remove when you're trying to fix the sentence. And just like someone said in the chat, unfortunately, fixing is a little bit more challenging, but ProWritingAid does help you in terms of saying, okay, these are what my glue words are, so you know kind of what you can remove or replace when you're coming to the rewording. But again, this is kind of why it's so important to not just fix it ourselves. We're never going to give you an option for fixing because, like we said, our goal is not to standardize everybody's writing, but to give you information about where your writing might be hard for your readers so you can effectively change it in that way. Okay, moving on to principle 3. So our third principle to making our writing more clear is to ensure that our readability score is appropriate for our audience. Now, what does that mean? An inexperienced author, we often make our writing too difficult to read. And this is actually also a problem that experienced authors face as well. Authors of all kinds often make their writing too difficult to read. And while it might sound strange, the most effective writers are always trying to make their work easier to read, not harder. Good writing should have an accessible language, which makes it more engaging. And this actually bears out with adult readers as well. So something that might surprise many of you is that adult readers actually prefer their books to be easier to read. So most mass market fiction books, as well as most news sources, write at the 7th grade reading level, which is the reading level that most adults prefer to read at. And if you're not in the US, that's about like a 12 to 13-year-old. So most adults like to read language that a 12 to 13-year-old could understand because that's most enjoyable for them. So when we're setting up stories for our audience, again, if you're writing for a mass market or for a mass adult audience, you're going to try to aim to make your work readable to a 7th grader. Now, let's talk a little bit more about what that specifically means, because sometimes people get nervous when I say that. So when I'm talking about readability, I'm talking really primarily about 4 things. First, your prose should be clear and easy to follow. So it's, we're eliminating passive voice, we have strong verbs, we're eliminating sticky sentences. Second, we're doing what I call using special word chips effectively. So let me explain special word chips. When I was working in curriculum, I often wrote assessments for elementary students. And when you're writing for elementary students, you have to be really, really careful about what words you use because they will have never heard the word before because they're really young. So I would have to write science and social studies assessments where I used some complicated words But I had to make the rest of the sentence easy enough that the sentence averaged out to an effective reading level for that age group. So I had to use what I call as my special word chips. So for instance, if I was writing a science assessment about biodiversity, I could use the word biodiversity, but all the words around biodiversity had to be really, really simple. So again, the sentence averaged out to an appropriate age level. So the same principle applies to us as we're writing fiction as adults. Or writing anything as adults, memoir, nonfiction, etc. too. You can use special words. So you can use whatever your version of fancy words are, but you should use them effectively. So use them where they count and where they matter, and not just like throwing them in so that every single word makes it, is so that your readers have to open a dictionary to figure out what you're saying. Like, again, we want to use them effectively where they carry weight. So for instance, if you are writing science fiction, maybe you're using your special word chips on how to describe a battle, or how to describe like how a spaceship is going from place to place, or the parts on a spaceship or something like that. If you're writing history, maybe you're using specific terms. But again, we can use these special word chips. We can use rich domain specific vocabulary, but we need to use it where it packs a punch, where it's important, not just every other word to make ourselves sound smart. In that place, if we do it that way, if we're just using special words all the time, our writing is going to be cheapened, and it's going to be harder for our readers to understand what we're saying. The other thing about readability is that our ideas become the stars. So readability really, again, goes back to that first principle of making sure that our ideas are what our readers are engaging with, not our word choices or our sentences. And finally, readability means that you've taken your audience's understanding into account. Who you're writing for will dictate what readability is. So if you're writing for college, or if you're writing for graduate school, or if you're writing an academic paper or a domain paper, your readability will probably be higher than 7th grade, because your audience will have a higher level of understanding. But if you're writing for mass market fiction, you're going to want to aim for that 7th grade level, because again, that's where most adults are reading at. So think about who you're writing for and what they will understand when determining what readability is. So again, I'm not saying that everybody has to write at 7th grade level. I'm saying you need to think critically about who your audience is, so that way you're able to determine the appropriate readability for them. Now, on the other hand, readability does not mean that your prose is boring or uninspired. So readability does not mean everything is specifically set up in the same exact way and it's rote, not at all. It also does not mean you don't use any interesting words. As I said before, you can totally use engaging, unique, exciting words, but you need to choose when you use them and use them effectively. It also does not mean that your writing is dumbed down or your ideas are uncomplicated. A lot of times people get very nervous and think that if I'm writing at a 7th grade readability, that means I have to write for 7th graders. And no, that could not be more untrue. You can write for adults. You can write complicated. You can write mature themes for adults. You can write content that is very specifically adult oriented, while still using language and sentence structure that meets adults at that comfortable reading level for them. Again, your ideas can be complicated. And as I said before, I would argue it's more important that if you have really complex ideas, that your prose is set up in a way that's easy for them to understand, so that they're not misinterpreting those ideas you set up. So how do you check this? The best way to check your readability is to use something called a readability score. Readability scores basically measure factors like sentence length, word familiarity, and they basically predict what age of reader would understand your writing. There's a bunch of different tests for this. There's the Dale Shaw, Flesch, Gunning-Fogg. They all say different things, but they all are basically saying the same thing, or the same thing in different ways, which is, again, who they predict who would be able to read your writing. The good thing about this is that you can find readability scores using most word processors. So Word has one. There's a variety of free readability calculators online, and that's totally fine. But you might run into some word count challenges. Now, just like with sticky sentences, there's not one way to fix this. So readability scores measure multiple factors, and it means we need to look at multiple things when we're trying to improve readability. So first, are you using easy to understand vocabulary? Again, special word chips. Are you using too many complicated words? Second, are your sentences short and to the point? So have you been able to eliminate sticky sentences, sticky words, take out glue words to make your sentences shorter and to the point? Are you using too much jargon? Jargon, cliches, domain-specific language, those get in the way of many readers' understanding, and so they'll bump up your readability score. Writing the passive voice, so saying something like the present was opened by Jane is more complicated than Jane opens the present, so passive voice boosts your readability score. And you can fix it by eliminating that. If you're wandering around too much in your prose, or if you have extra words from your sentences, all of these things can affect your readability score. So it's important to ask yourself all of these questions when you're trying to bring your readability down. It's not just one thing. Now, in ProWritingAid, we can help you with this, though, just like I said, we won't always suggest quick fixes. So our readability report gives you an overview of your overall document readability score, as well as breaks your paragraphs down into slightly difficult to read, or easy to read. So that way you know where to spend your time, so you're not just going through your whole document wandering around trying to figure out how to fix it. Also, in our style report, we will make specific readability enhancements. So it'll show examples of ways you can fix things like hidden verbs. So decide is easier than made the decision. So there's also ways that you can make changes using the style check and in the real-time checker as well to improve your readability. But there is not just one way. Okay, our fourth principle is to choose specific and vivid words. So now we're getting into that second part. The first half of the presentation, we talked a lot about how to make our writing simple and clear. Now we're going to talk about making it specific and vivid, because remember, clarity is not just always about simplicity, it's about how specific you are as well. So a lot of times writers will use vague words that lack the clarity your readers want. So for instance, calling somebody tall in your writing. Tall is very subjective. I am personally very short, and so everybody is tall to me. So tall does not give me enough specificity as a reader to understand what that means. Same thing goes for words like more or poor or good or excellent. You know, what I view as excellent might be different than what someone else on this presentation views as excellent. So understanding and choosing more specific and clear words makes your writing more effective. So here's an example. Kate made some improvements to her cabin and now it's worth more. This sentence is incredibly vague. Some improvements could be anything. I am not very handy, so some improvements means like she cleaned or something like that. Whereas my mom is an architect, so if I told her that somebody made improvements to their cabin, she'd be like, oh, did they redesign their kitchen? Did they add new tiles to the bathroom? So again, it's too vague. Our reader is not going to understand it. Same thing for worth more. What worth more to me means is very different than what worth more to my mother means. So this sentence is not specific enough. We need to clarify our meaning so our readers don't understand, or do understand better. Don't misunderstand, rather. So an example would be to say, Kate replaced the bathroom suite, repainted the living room, and laid hardwood floors in her cabin. As a result, its value has increased by 10%. Now, this is much more specific than the prior example. Now we know exactly what Kate did, as well as exactly how much value her cabin's worth increased by. Now, I want to point out that this sentence is much longer and wordier than what came before. But the key piece about this is that almost every word in here is a working word. So it's not always about cutting out words, but it's about prioritizing specific words to get our meaning across as much as possible. And it's important here to, again, note, clarity does not always equal brevity. So we're not always trying to trim, cut. We're trying to make things simple, but also specific. And sometimes to be specific, we need to add more words in. But the goal with being more specific is that we're adding, again, working words into our sentences. So again, this is not an easy fix, so we can't always just say, hey, like, how do I make this more specific? But one of the things that you can ask yourself is the movie the reader playing in their head accurate to what I'm trying to show? So if I say Kate made some improvements, you know, if you picture a reader playing that movie, are they going to play the right one? Are they going to play like, you know, something where Chip and Joanna Gaines are redoing a house, or are they going to play Haley cleaning up her bedroom, right? What movie will they play? And if it's not very clear, then the goal at that point is to go back in and fix that sentence to make it more clear. Now, ProWritingAid can do a bit to help you with that. Our diction report will highlight vague and abstract words. So if there are words like pretty or tall or that type of thing, you can come in here and you can add, it'll highlight places where you've used that language to make fixes. Again, narrowing in on places that makes it more effective for you. Oops, okay, and our final principle is to show our readers what's happening, not tell them. And again, this is going into our language here. So telling emotions rather than showing them is a common mistake, especially for newer authors. Many inexperienced readers will tell writers will tell their readers what a character is feeling instead of using language to describe the emotions instead. Now, there will certainly be points in your writing where it makes more sense to tell rather than show if you're trying to keep the pace up or something like that. But overall, our primary goal is to paint that vivid picture that we were just talking about that will engross our readers in their writing. So here's an example of telling. When Mary saw her test grade, she was embarrassed. So in this very simple sentence, the writer has told the reader everything they need to know about Mary, that she was embarrassed. In our second example, which is again longer, we are now more vivid. We're creating a more effective picture for our reader. So when Mary saw the big red F on her work, her cheeks flushed red. She crumpled the test, hid it in her desk, hoping no one noticed. So now we're not just knowing that Mary was embarrassed, but we're actually drawing our reader in so that they can create that vivid picture that our readers will understand. So when you tell your reader everything that your character's thinking and feeling, you take away the nuance in their interpretation. Showing, on the other hand, allows them to draw in with that specific, vivid language. So we have to walk this fine line of showing so that they can draw their own interpretations, but we need to make it clear and specific enough in our language choice so that they understand what we're trying to say. So when we create this deeper relationship by showing, again, we're using showing in a very, very, very specific way so that our readers are able to create the accurate picture of what we're trying to say. And we can do this by using something called the camera test. So the camera test is basically when you look at a sentence and you say, hey, if a camera was trying to take a picture of this, could my reader know what I'm saying? So here's an example. Tell land is a peaceful kingdom with happy, prosperous citizens. The king is beloved by his people, and both rich and poor live in harmony. So if I was trying to film Tell Land, if I was a director coming in to make this movie, I would need so much more information. I can't tell if Tell Land is by the sea, if it's in the mountains, like that picture we looked at earlier. I just need a bunch more information about what peaceful looks like. I don't even know if this is in modern times, if this is before, if this is in the future, what's going on here. So again, this comes into the idea of showing, not telling. If we can't pick up what the camera would pick up, then we're doing too much telling. So even if we go back to our previous example where we said Mary was embarrassed, a camera can't pick up embarrassed. A camera doesn't know what that is, but a camera can pick up the what embarrassed looks like. So a camera can pick up that her cheeks flushed red. It can pick up the action of her hiding the test in her desk. So we need to have, again, that descriptive language to make sure the camera can pick up what we're trying to say. And then ProWritingAid can help you with this as well. So our style report, as well as our real-time checker, can help you find emotion tells, which are places where you're telling about something rather than showing them. And then this will also show up in your real-time checker, depending on how you have set your document. It will set up here in your goals as well. So you can see that this document has far too many emotion tells. So that's something that you'll need to fix in order to make your writing more effective. Okay, so today, to sum up, and then we'll have some time for questions, we talked about what clarity means for our readers, why clarity is so important, as well as 5 ways to improve the clarity of your writing. Again, what I want you to take away from today is that clarity is a sliding scale, and what's clear for my readers will be different than what's clear for everybody else's readers on this call. But the goal is to, again, think critically about how we are using language and how we can make our fixes to make our writing more effective. So with all of that being said, we have a few minutes for questions. So if you want to use the Q&A function, I am happy to jump into questions. I know a couple people asked about using ProWritingAid, so I'm just going to drop our links in the chat again. That final link has a way that you can sign up to do a free ProWritingAid trial. and I will wait for questions to come in. What is a good percentage for emotion tells? That's a good question. So within our goals, we have in ProWritingAid, you can have it up here. It really depends on the document type. So if you're writing specific types of creative fiction, it'll vary within there. So again, and one of the things we can do is shift what your genre is here to make it effective for that particular genre. But again, it will vary if you're doing fiction versus nonfiction and that type of thing. Middle grade, is going to likely be a little bit higher because the language is going to be different. And we, just to give you some more info on that, Lori, we measure emotion tells as not a percentage necessarily overall, but occurrences within a specific amount of writing. So if you converted that to like percentage, like maybe around 30%, but again, we look at it as kind of occurrences throughout a specific number of paragraphs and sentences. Any tips for creating clarity in fantasy or science fiction exposition, especially when you want to make it more mysterious or whimsical? I do. So I will just plug Fantasy Writers Week again, because we will be talking a lot about that at Fantasy Writers Week. So a couple things are to, again, use those kind of special word chips on the things that matter. So use them on words that are domain specific for that, but don't make every other word like a really complicated fantasy or science fiction term. So use it again where it matters. And then use clearer verbs. I think that can help. Also with exposition, I think pacing will help. So if you're doing a lot of exposition on in science fiction and fantasy of like giant battle scenes or even world building or setting anything up like that, your pacing can start to lag at that point. And so really shifting back into sentence length at that stage and saying, okay, are my sentences short enough so that it's not weighing my reader down? And then also, can I remove any of my glue words for that point? So again, keeping up the pacing to kind of create that feeling of both like whimsy and mystery, but also whimsy and mystery moving forward, where you're not just kind of plowing through a lot of pieces like that. Okay, so sometimes ProWritingAid suggests changing the way sentences start, forcing one to start some sentences without the subject or using passive voice. Again, yeah, so this is a great point. So when I say starting with the subject, I don't always mean that you have to do that every single time. And again, sometimes we're working against a number of different features here. So we're working against the fact that you will have passive voice, but you won't, you will sometimes remove passive voice, but you won't always remove passive voice. So at certain points, it's okay. The other thing that you said, the other thing that's a part of that is that within passive voice, right? Or within sentence starts, we don't always want all of our sentences to be subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object. So that's what we're prioritizing, but we want to create like that rhythm and that musicality. So some will start with gerunds, some will start with conjunctions, that type of thing. There will be changes within the ways our sentence starts as well, to again, create it so that we're not just always relying on one construction, because then that could get into the lens of being boring. So again, with these principles, they're like principles and not rules, because we're always attracting with nuance. So someone says, I'm surprised you said to shoot for a 7th grade reading level. A lot of popular authors are writing at grade 5 to 6. Yeah, and a lot, I would say like anywhere from like 5 to 8 is something that a lot of popular authors are writing at. And what I mean by shooting for 6 is like, again, it goes back to who your audience is. If you're writing, again, mass market, you're going to be somewhere in that neighborhood, but it might be a little bit lower or a little bit higher depending on what you're specifically writing and who your specific audience is. I think the key there is that if you're writing for adults in a mass consumption format, you don't want to be at a 12th grade reading level, right? So if you're writing fiction, and this is again something that a lot of inexperienced authors do, they say, oh, I'm writing for adults, I need to write at 12th grade or something like that. We should always be in those kind of middle grade areas if we're looking for mass fiction. And again, where within that will depend on who your audience is and what your writing is and what your writing style is as well. So writing in that 5th or 6th grade level is totally fine. It just depends. And again, for all of these, they're rules. Are there not rules? They are things that you should be assessing with your writing to see what makes sense. So someone asked about functionality that can point us towards inconsistency of tenses. Yeah, that's a tough one, and we don't quite have the AI for that. It's hard to judge, because if you think within a fiction story, for instance, at certain points they might be talking about something that happened in the past versus something that's happening in the present. So we don't have quite. We're working on it, but we don't have quite that yet. And then someone asked about the ProWritingAid software again, so I'm just going to drop that link one more time to sign out. Oops. Doesn't trying to be very visually descriptive makes your sentences wordy? Yes, it can. And so again, sometimes, so if you have a couple wordy sentences in your document, your readability is not going to go up high. But if every single sentence is really wordy, then your readability will be increased. Okay, so we need to look at multiple factors. So when you're going to readability and wordiness, right? It's not just sentence length. There are many factors that influence readability. So sentence length is one of them, but it's not all. And then also, when we talk about this in the terms of glue words and sticky words, a visually descriptive sentence is not necessarily one with a lot of sticky words. So just like we said with that improvements example for Kate, when she was improving her house, that sentence was wordier. It had far more words than the one before, but it all had working words, because if we changed any of them, the meaning of the sentence would change. So again, it is okay to be wordier and to use visually descriptive words, but I would encourage you to lean on working words and not just having a wordy sentence that's full of glue words. And similarly to the person who had the question about writing for fantasy, it's okay to have some sections where you have slower pacing. And then it's okay to have places where you have faster pacing. But we want to assess, okay, in my description, it might be fine to have a lot of slower sentences, a lot of slower pacing as I'm setting up exposition or backstory. But then when I get to action scenes, maybe I want it to move a little bit faster. So again, you're thinking about, hey, is my pacing too slow here? Are my sentences too wordy here? Actually, that's fine, because this is a description setting. So I'm by no means suggesting that you change every single one of your sentences. But again, you think about, where is the sentence? How is it functioning in my overall manuscript? And should I change it at that point? Or is it okay to leave it as is? And again, if I think that I need to change it, are the words sticky in the sentence, or are they working? And if they're leaning towards working, then you might end up keeping it as well. Okay. We have, regarding passive sentences, we have an example. Alex realized that an envelope had been slipped under her bedroom door overnight. So realized is not necessarily a weak verb, but we do have had been slipped. So in that sentence, like if you decided that Alex doesn't know who the envelope slipped, you might want to leave it as passive voice in that instance. And that and "an" are glue words. So that will probably flag as glue words within there. So for instance, you could eliminate that. You could say, Alex realized an envelope had been slipped under her bedroom door overnight, and the sentence's meaning wouldn't change. Okay, I think those are all of our questions today. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Again, I'm happy to email out the slides after this tomorrow. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We would love to see you at Fantasy Writers Week a couple weeks from now. And we will talk to you soon. Lori, thank you so much for coming. It was great to have you all here. Have a great day, everybody.